Most people imagine Japanese as quiet and reserved, but then you meet someone like this. Someone who talks to strangers, reacts loudly, jokes naturally, and somehow makes you feel close in just a few seconds. This kind of energy is especially common in a region called Kansai, the western part of Japan, including Osaka, Kyoto, and Kobe. And actually, this is where I grew up. So for me, this way of talking, joking, and reacting felt completely normal. But the strange thing is, Japan is often seen as one of the homogeneous countries in the world. So what exactly makes Kansai people so different? The first thing you notice in Kansai is the distance between people. In many parts of Japan, politeness often means not disturbing others. On trains, people stay quiet. At convenience stores, conversations are short and functional. So even when someone looks lost, many people hesitate before speaking to them. But in Kansai, that distance feels much smaller. If you look lost at the station, someone might casually ask, "Where are you going?" In an elevator, one small comment can turn into a short conversation. At the shop, the interaction might include a joke, a reaction, or a little, extra warmth.
飲み屋で隣の席の頼んでるメニューが気になってね、天ぷらみたいなやつがあって、その天ぷらがね、美味しそうに見えたの。その天ぷら何って。
Of course, not every Kansai person is like this, but compared to many other parts of Japan, talking to someone you don't know feels much less unusual. And this is important because it changes the whole atmosphere of the daily life. In Tokyo, kindness is often shown by giving people space, but in Kansai, kindness is often shown by closing that space. And this sense of closeness becomes even stronger through Kansai-ben.
全部の役をやる覚悟あるか
which is Kansai dialect, is not just a different way of pronouncing Japanese. It changes the emotional distance between people somehow. Compared to standard Japanese, Kansai-ben often sounds more rhythmic, more expressive, and more reactive. For example, in standard Japanese, someone might say, ちょっと何してるの?びっくりするんだけど. This is a standard Japanese, but in Kansai, it might become ちょ何してんほんまびっくりするわ. So the meaning is almost the same. No, it's exactly the same, but the feeling is different. It sounds less formal, more emotional, and somehow closer. And this distance is not only about the sentence. Even when we say the exact same thing, the melody can sound completely different. Okay, so for example, take a simple phrase like Pokemon card. In standard Japanese, it sounds like this, Pokemon card. It has a very flat and consistent tone. But in Kansai, many people would say it more like Pokemon card. The words are exactly the same, even though it's the same in English, but the rhythm, the rise and the fall, and the emotional feeling are different. Even if you don't understand Japanese, you can probably hear that Kansai-ben often feels more, musical, more expressive, and more alive, maybe. And when talking about Kansai people, you can't ignore humor. And Kansai humor is not just entertainment, it's part of how people communicate. Even in normal conversations, people often add small jokes, exaggerate their reactions or response in a playful way. This is where Kansai starts to feel very different from many other parts of Japan. In some places, being a good listener means staying quiet, nodding, not interrupting. But in Kansai, reacting quickly can also be a way of showing that you are listening.
お待たせしました。
ビール。
私も
俺もビールで。
カシスロンで。
ビールちゃうんかい。
と突っ込んでくること。
そこはビールやろ。
This is closely connected to the idea of boke and tsukkomi. Boke is when someone says something silly, exaggerated, or slightly off. And tsukkomi is the quick reaction that points it out. Of course, this is famous in Japanese comedy, but in Kansai, a softer version of it often appears in everyday conversation. So as I told you, I grew up in Kansai, and from my experience, people there are often very aware of whether the atmosphere feels fun or not. So for example, among friends, if someone says something that doesn't really, land, people might casually say, "omonna," which means that's not funny, that's boring actually. If you translate directly, it sounds harsh, but in Kansai, this kind of reaction can be surprisingly normal. It doesn't always mean say something funnier. It's more like a quick, honest reaction, a way to say that didn't work, and keep the atmosphere from becoming flat. So the goal is not always to be, hilarious. The goal is to keep the moment alive. A small joke, a quick reaction, or even a playful comment can become part of the rhythm of talking. Of course, not every Kansai person is loud or funny, and not everyone is trying to be a comedian, of course. But compared to many other parts of Japan, people in Kansai often seem more, conscious of whether the mood is moving, whether people are reacting, and whether the moment feels enjoyable. In other words, laughter is not just something people consume. It's a way of reducing distance between people. And this is one reason Kansai people can sometimes feel like they come from a completely different world, even though they are still Japanese. And once you start noticing this difference in communication, you begin to see it everywhere. Even small everyday habits feel slightly different in Kansai. In Tokyo, people usually stand on the left side of the escalator, but in many parts of Kansai, especially Osaka, people stand on the right. The food tastes different too. Kansai cuisine is often known for its lighter and more delicate flavor, especially in things like soup stock and noodles. Even in the convenience stores, you can sometimes find the products labeled Kansai style, as if Kansai has its own version of Japan. Individually, these differences may seem small. The way people stand on escalators, the way soup tastes, the way people speak, joke, or react. None of these things alone can explain Kansai. But when they all come together, they create a feeling that, this region follows a slightly different set of rules. And this is why Kansai people are often seen as somehow, different, even though they are, of course, just as Japanese as anyone else. But these differences did not appear out of nowhere. They are deeply connected to the long history of Kansai itself, especially the history of Osaka and Kyoto, where businesses, conversation, and human connections shape the personality of the region. To understand why Kansai people feel so different, we need to compare Kansai with Tokyo, because these two regions grew out of two very different kinds of society. About 400 years ago, Japan entered a long stretch of history we now call the Edo period, which lasted from the early 1600 to the mid-1800s. At that time, the city we know today as Tokyo was still called Edo, and it became the political center of the country. Edo was the home of the shogun, Japan's top military ruler, along with samurai warriors, government officials, and a strict social hierarchy. In that world, your position decided almost everything: how you spoke, where you sat, who you could approach, and how. Speaking too much, reacting too strongly, or being too casual could easily be seen as rude. Politeness in Edo developed around self-control. You are expected to read the room, hold yourself back, and not disturb the people around you. This is the social logic you can still see and feel on the quiet, Tokyo train today. The politeness of resistance, the kindness of distance. On the other hand, Kansai grew out of a completely different kind of society. Osaka, the biggest city in the Kansai region, was not mainly a city of samurai. It was a city of merchants, trade, food, money, and movement. Kyoto, just nearby, had served as Japan's imperial capital for more than 1,000 years before Tokyo eventually took over that role. It carried its own long tradition of craftsmen, merchant, temples, and, court culture. So instead of one strict vertical hierarchy, this region was built on horizontal connections between sellers and buyers, makers and customers, neighbors and strangers. So in that kind of society, hierarchy alone could not run, daily life. Trust between people had to be built on the spot, not assumed from social position. You could not simply rely on rank to decide how an interaction would go. You had to actually meet the other person, not just sit politely next to them. That is the structural reason these two regions develop such different, instinct. Edo grew from a society of rank, where the safest thing was to hold yourself back. Kansai grew from a society of exchange, where the smartest thing was to engage. Neither is better than the other. they are simply two different answers to two very different kinds of society. So now let's zoom in on what happened inside that merchant world, because this is where Kansai's personality really took shape. In a merchant city, conversation was not a side activity around business. Conversation was the business itself. The price tag was only a starting point. The real deal happened in the back and forth. The timing of a reply, the warmth of a small joke, the way you read whether the customer was actually hesitating or just performing hesitation. These were not personality traits, they were trained skills, sharpened in the shops and markets across generations. So think about the seller in a busy Osaka market. Two stores sell the same fish at the same price. What decides where customers go? Often the atmosphere. The seller who can drop a quick joke, react warmly when someone walks by, or remember a regular, faces customer, that seller wins. So humor in Kansai didn't start as entertainment. It started as a tool. A joke could lower a customer's guard. A quick comeback could show you were paying attention. A friendly tease could turn a stranger into a regular. Over centuries, that toolkit became part of the religion's instinct. You can still feel like traces of this in everyday life. For example, people in Kansai often try to negotiate, especially when buying something expensive. And my grandmother and my father would casually push for a better price on big purchases. When I was younger, I honestly found it a little embarrassing. To be honest, it's still embarrassing though. I think, why do you have to say that, But now I understand that differently a bit. It's about treating the interaction as a real conversation between two people, not a fixed script. But in many parts of Japan, that kind of negotiation can feel uncomfortable because it breaks the smooth, quiet flow of an interaction. In Kansai, it does the opposite. Talking directly, reacting honestly, and adding a bit of humor can actually make the interaction feel more natural because it shows that both sides are present, not just performing politeness. Kansai has a long tradition of treating conversation as a craft, something you get better at, something worth respecting in another person. That is why the image of Kansai people as talkative, expressive, and quick to react didn't appear out of nowhere. It came from generations of people for whom good conversation was not just charm, it was livelihood. But here's the question. Kansai is still just one region of Japan, and even with all its merchant traditions, that alone wouldn't have been enough to make this regional personality stand out across the entire country, Japan. So what actually pushed it onto the national stage? The turning point came with the rise of Manzai.
今年の夏はいろんなことありましたけどね、いろんな時期がありましたもん。パンダ死んだり、ライオンが、虎が撃たれたりね。そう、逃げちゃって。虎なんかやっぱりね、飼うときはちゃんと鍵かけなきゃダメですよ。これは本当ですよ。もううちなんかやっぱり猛獣飼ってますけどね、もう檻なんか40にしてあってね、鍵なんか10個ぐらいついてるんですよ。だからうちのおばあちゃん逃げたことありませんよ。待てよ。いや、みんながおばあちゃん。
Manzai is a stage from of the same, bokeh and tsukumi I explained before, dynamic we saw earlier in everyday Kansai conversation.
Perfect.
お前だよ。
But shaped into a performance art. Two people, perfectly timed, the bokeh drops a strange line on purpose and the tsukumi snaps back hard, often with a sharp comment and sometimes with a little slap on the shoulder or head. The whole thing happens first. The timing itself becomes a joke. It is comedy that runs on pure conversation, on the same rhythm and reaction speed that merchant culture had been training for centuries. The roots of Manzai go back surprisingly far, more than 1,000 years ago, to the Heian period, roughly the 9th century to 12th centuries. It started as part of Shinto festivals, a ritual performance meant to entertain the gods through witty dialogue. But from the Edo period into the early 20th century, it slowly transformed into entertainment for ordinary people, flourishing, most of all in Kansai and Kyoto, the heart of the Kansai region known in old Japan as Kamigata, the upper region, the cultural center of its time. Then in 1912, a company called Yoshimoto Kogyo took this local art form and built a real industry around it. To give you a sense of scale, Yoshimoto today is almost as much a household name in Japan as Toyota. The company built theaters across the country, opened schools to train young comedians, and turned making people laugh into an actual profession. In doing so, they transformed Kansai into what people now call the capital of Japanese comedy. After the Second World War, as television spread across Japan, Yoshimoto comedians suddenly found themselves performing not for a theater audience, but for the entire nation. And here is the interesting part: their style. Their style was almost perfectly designed for TV. Fast banter, sharp reactions, big facial expressions, and real human warmth. All of it translated beautifully onto the small screen. Quiet, formal humor would have struggled in that medium, but Kansai comedy, born in noisy markets and shaped by centuries of customer interaction, fit right in. Before long, Kansai-born comedians were appearing on almost every type of show, variety programs, talk show, morning news, even cooking segment. The Kansai accent, once a regional dialect, slowly became the standard sound of laughter on Japanese television. And that is how comedy and Kansai itself came to dominate Japanese media. Today, ORI, which means comedy, Japanese comedy, is part of everyday life, and the idea that comedy equals Kansai has become deeply ingrained in the country's cultural identity. But the influence did not stop on the screen. Once comedy equals Kansai settled into the country's cultural identity, the line between a comedian and a Kansai person started to blur in the public imagination. What is most unusual about Kansai though is not that image itself. It's what happened when Kansai-ben leaves Kansai. In most of Japan, when someone from the countryside moves to Tokyo, for example, for work, university, whatever, they slowly drop their local accent. People from Tohoku, Kyushu, Hokkaido often switch to standard Tokyo Japanese within a year or maybe two. Regional accents can carry an old image of being rural or rough sometimes, but the Kansai people are different. A person born in Osaka, especially, who moves to Tokyo at, let's say, 20, often still speaks Kansai-ben at 50. They do not switch, they do not feel they need to, and no one really expects them to, maybe. Even more striking is what happens to the people around them. Kansai-ben is famously contagious. Spend a few months with Kansai friends and you will start saying "Honma?" instead of "really," or borrowing the classic comedian phrase "Nande?" Even the word "tsukkomi" has crossed into standard Japanese. Anyone, anywhere in the country uses it now as a verb. Other regional dialects almost never travel like this, but the Kansai-ben does, because decades of comedy have given it a status no other dialect has. Warm, funny, alive, something people want to borrow rather than hide. Most regions in Japan adapt to the center. Kansai export itself somehow. So where does the image of the special Kansai person actually come from? Partly from comedians, yes. People raised in cities shaped by merchant culture, a culture that valued human warmth, conversation, and humor. But it also comes from the simple fact that Kansai has refused for over a century to be quietly absorbed into the rest of Japan. The dialect stays, the humor stays, the way of interacting stays. So when people call Kansai different, what they are really pointing at is something much older than the stereotypes. For centuries, this region has been answering one of the oldest questions in any culture. What does it mean to respect another person in its own way? Most of Japan answers with restraint. Kansai answers with engagement. And once you have followed the long path that led here from the merchants of Osaka through the rhythm of manzai onto the screen of every household in the country, it starts feeling like the part of Japan that simply refuses to grow quiet. And that's the Kansai. Does your country have something similar regions inside one country that feel like completely different worlds? Let me know in the comments below. There's also one thing I could not fit into this video. Even within Kansai, people do not see each other as one group, honestly. Kyoto, Osaka, and Kobe especially quietly think of each other as completely different. If that sounds interesting, I go into the whole story in the members only video, link in the description below, so please check it. And if you are not a member, don't worry, this video right here will take you into another side of Japan you probably haven't seen yet. Alright, so thanks so much for watching. See you in the next video.